Hello, this is Dr. Mike, and I wanted to just give you a short from my perspective on this second week of our class, where we turn to study the Greek civilization, which is one of the great civilizations of history. We owe a great deal to them for their contributions to our beliefs, our thoughts. And so I think this week will be a very eye-opening event for you as you look at the things that we look to the Greeks for, besides just history. Of course, they produced Herodotus, the first historian, but they're also their ideals of philosophy. Most of the philosophical things that you'll study in your undergraduate years will have a Greek foundation, and you will come to learn a great deal about them from that. Among the other things that we owe them a great contribution or a great debt for their contribution is the ideals of democracy. Democracy kind of started with the Greeks in that Athens is the only real true Greek or true democracy in the world that we've ever really had, in which one man was given one vote. And it was on a smaller scale, being a city, so that it worked for them very well. And it's very kind of impractical for a country or anything of large scale. When our founding fathers set out to determine what kind of government they're going to give us in 1787, they argued over a complete democracy where every man got one vote, or a kingship in which George Washington would be king, other things like that. And as Mr. Franklin was leaving the Constitutional Hall one day, someone asked him, said, "Mr. Franklin, what kind of government have you given us?" He said, "A republic, sir, if you can keep it." And that's exactly one of the things that we will see developing in the Roman Empire in the Republic era, the first start of the Roman Empire before it turned into an empire, was the idea of a representative body which voted on behalf of the citizenry that was elected from the people. So democracy, it directly lends itself to the ideas that we hold most sacred in the American government. The Greeks rose to fame basically under the leadership of Alexander the Great, who as a young man uh, rose to power on the death of his father. They were Macedonian, they were not Greek. And the Macedonians captured the Greeks and took over their country. And Alexander the Great went on a whirlwind tour to capture most of the world, which he did. In fact, he never came back to Greece again once he had left. And so they went as far as Egypt, and he became actually a pharaoh of Egypt. And then they went to the east and ended up in India, which was the furthest point that they went. The stories are told about Alexander, of course, as a young man. He died at 32, started about 21, 22 as the emperor. And stories are told that he wept in India because he had no more worlds to conquer. Actually, his men were in rebellion. They had been home in years and wanted to go back and see their families. And so they refused to go any further than India. If you ever want to read something really interesting, read about them and their battles with doing warfare with elephants in India. Alexander the Great was a very interesting young man in that he carried with him a scientist. Aristotle, who was his tutor, who was Plato's nephew, went along on their travels and recorded plant life, flora and fauna, and tried to make sense of the planet and understand it well within the limitations of their understanding in that day. But the Greeks left a sense of science and engineering and understanding. One of the interesting things about the Greeks is they're people of science. When you compare them to the Romans, who were technology people, Rome had very little science, lots of technology. They invented concrete. They built things that lasted forever. We're still using the aqueducts in France to carry water to cities that the Romans built ever how many hundreds of years ago. You see the Roman road, the Appian Way in Rome, that's still built there without potholes, nonetheless. Maybe we should send some engineers back in history to learn how to build roads without potholes. But they were great engineers. The Greeks, on the other hand, were more interested in the science and the thought behind things. And so you're going to see that transition as we move forward, talking about both Romans and Greeks. In this week's writing assignment in your discussion board, you're going to do a comparative essay between the religions of the ancient civilization. I consider myself a religionist in addition to being a historian, and I study the religions of the world and have done so from ancient times up into the present. And there are there are many similarities in the religions of every culture. In fact, it's interesting. I don't think we've ever discovered a culture that did not have some kind of religion. And the more you dig into those, the more similarities you find. Now, for those of us that accept the biblical account, there are reasons for that. We realize that men all came from the first parents, Adam and Eve. So we're all going to have a certain base knowledge of religions, and we're going to share that as it's passed down from generation to generation. I think if you really want to understand religions, reading Romans 1 will tell you what happened to mankind after they left the Garden of Eden. Because the Bible says in Romans that men gave themselves over to various things and that God gave them over finally. They keep going after their own devices and doing their own things and did not like to retain God in their knowledge. And so they gave themselves over to do things that weren't convenient in the flesh. And finally it says, and God gave them over to do those things. So how do we get to the point where we pick up this understanding of mankind and their religions and being so far away from the worship of Yahweh and the one true God that we see in the Garden of Eden and down through those early years, which, by the way, is not written down for us until Moses' time. And so, as we said at the beginning, we don't really consider talking about that as history because we don't have written records. But we, by faith, believe the first 5 books of Genesis are 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We believe those by faith to be an actual valid record. So basically, from the Garden of Eden down to the flood, we get an account in the Bible of what happened to man, how they wandered away, and then we get an account after the flood, how they tend to do the same thing. And those are the ones that come down to us in our narrative here that will eventually be groups that we talk about, such as the Hebrews, the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians. All of those people were descendants from a son of Noah, so that we all have common ground to talk about. So in considering these things, the Hebrew religion is unique in that it is monotheistic as opposed to the polytheist of those who are around them. That means they worship many gods. If you, in the Egyptian sections, well, we're amazed at the number of gods that were worshipped. If you go to India, Hinduism has over 10,000 gods that are worshipped. When you get to the New Testament, one of the interesting things was that the Romans had no problem with adding Jesus Christ to the list of their pantheon of gods. They would have set him up in a temple, but the problem was the exclusivity, that he must be the only God. We worship him and him only. There is no other God but Jehovah. Those are the things that got the Jews and later the Christians in trouble with the Romans, is that they demanded he be the one, the only God. So as you look at that and think about that in light of other relations, think about the polytheistic views, and then think about the monotheistic view of the Hebrews. The other thing that we are indebted to with the Hebrews is their idea of linear time, that there is a past, a present, and a future. Now, it's hard for us to go back and conceive of anything like that in our minds because we've always been taught to think linearly. But there was, for most people, there was no idea of progress, of moving forward, moving up in life. You were born into your lot, you stayed there till you died. But with the Hebrews and their concept of God, it emphasized the worth of the individual, of the individual unit, so that a person had value. He was not just a slave. He was not just someone who worked to death, but he did have value, and his soul had value. And that soul had to be taken care of and had to be, propitiated against its sins. And then there was going to be a future for that. So that's relatively new for the Hebrews and something that you might want to think about. So as you begin to work through the materials this week, I think you'll find it interesting. And I hope you do anyway. I hope you'll read your materials and hope you'll, think about the things on this tape. And if you ever have a comment you'd like to make back to me, I'm thrilled to hear from you. So until next time, thank you. This is From My Perspective.